there's a general fact sheet, draft sewage sludge risk assessment, and then there's a specific fact sheet also for farmers if you represent that sector. States are getting into this issue in a very significant way. We have, I think, 30 or 31 states that have issued or are issuing biosolids management plans. This is from the state of Minnesota, and I call this out only to make passing reference to it. This panel is not about strategies for reducing or eliminating PFAS from biosolids, but there's a lot of learning out there if that's something that is important to you, your clients, your constituencies. This is Maine. Maine has a plan as well, a biosolids management plan. That's on the left side of the screen, and on the right side of the screen, this is a wonderful report generated by the Environmental Council of States. It is a state-by-state review of all state agencies that have biosolid management plans. And an industry document that I like very much, this is ITRC, which is best in class. They have a wonderful fact sheet on identification and management of risk in biosolids with respect to PFAS. And they also have a wonderful conceptual site model showing pathways from wastewater treatment plants to various receptors. And then finally, this issue is very much in the news, even as recently as yesterday. On the left side of the screen, this is a report in Inside EPA, which is a wonderful industry trade journal. For those who want to follow these developments closely, it's required reading. This first article, published April 3rd, reflects that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is involved in encouraging a panel of scientific advisors to recommend a unique definition of PFAS that would cover chemicals likely present in agricultural environments, so that we're all on the same page. And then finally, yesterday, which is a good segue to the transactional issues we're going to discuss in a moment with this panel, it was reported yesterday that the Wisconsin governor, Torley Evans, is proposing to exempt owners of residential and agricultural land contaminated by PFAS-containing sewage sludge from liability under the state's spills law. That's something that we may need here eventually. When this issue emerges fully formed, which I think it will in short order, but I'm very much interested in what my colleagues have to say about all of this. And so with those brief remarks, I hope they were brief. It's easy to lose all sense of time when you're up here. I'm grateful that my colleagues are here, and we are going to now begin the question and answer session and get their perspective, and we want your perspective as well. So feel free to raise your hand, and we have microphones, I believe, around the room. Okay, very good. You know what, I'm going to enlist my colleague. Is Tori McCaffrey here? Tori, in the back? Would you assist in the questions and answers? Fabulous. Okay. So I'm going to start the questioning with Robyn Neely. We've got some questions for the lawyers. So Robyn first, please, and then Howard. Given the growing concern, which I detailed in my opening remarks, and the level of response that's only now emerging at the federal level and in many states across the country, how concerned should lawyers be on behalf of their clients that PFAS and biosolids constitutes a material risk of exposure to liability in a beneficial reuse context?
My experience and the information that you provide, I think attorneys and clients should be very concerned. I'm not suggesting that it's something in every transaction, but it's something to be concerned about in many transactions where we have agricultural lands that are being redeveloped. You know, there's certain key questions that need to be asked and evaluated.
Howard?
My apologies, I'm moving a little slow today. It's an aspect of getting old. There's a couple of questions embedded in that. One of which is, I think, a common misunderstanding of what biosolids are, and that drives a lot of the inquiry. I, as Michael mentioned before, had a conversation with a consultant and an attorney for a land bank that was acquiring a client's property, and they were pushing for us to test on this agricultural site for PFAS because of the biosolid application.
And did you represent the seller or the?
I was representing the developer. This was the land bank that was going to be acquiring the property for redevelopment. And I may be getting a little bit older and my eyesight may be going, but I read through the phase 1 7 or 8 times, and I don't recall seeing biosolid applications. And so I asked them about it, and the consultant, who was a relatively experienced consultant, said, well, but they've been applying cow manure as part of their agricultural process. And it's a difficult conversation to have with an experienced consultant that cattle manure is not a biosolid. Biosolids have a fairly involved definition under Code of Federal Regulations defined into two classes, Class A and Class B, but biosolids are generally the dried product or the solidified product from municipal waste streams. It is the sludge. And coming into that, but that cow manure, while it may have some other issues, some TMDL issues, some nitrogen loading issues, isn't really a suspect biosolid. So it becomes that kind of tension on, you don't want to under-test and miss something that would put your client at risk, but you also don't want to needlessly over-test, because on the other side of the spectrum, my group looked at a former family farm site up in Minnesota, and prior reports, and there was no biosolid application in any report. And prior reports had tested, just as a matter of course, for PFAS and found it at trace levels, which is tough to do without being an exceedance. And we questioned the family that had owned the property for generations, and our consultant, who's a good Midwestern consultant, was going through their shed and found a half-filled bag of milorganite. And I don't know how many of you were backyard farmers when you were growing up, but there we go. But milorganite is a commonly used and sold everywhere fertilizer process. It is also the dried municipal waste sludge from the city of Milwaukee's water treatment plants, and chock full of PFAS, arguably, as well as tomato seeds and other products. What? And arsenic, yes, thank you very much. So it becomes a kind of a understanding the issue to figure out testing, but for my group, if there's biosolid application and finding out if indeed there was is a little difficult, is always a testing issue for us. The issue of finding it becomes the problem. Mike, I noticed you noted the registry processes, but those are fairly new in terms of implementation for biosolid applications, and local governments or local wastewater authorities have been doing biosolid application as a way to get rid of their sludge for a very, very, very long time. Milorganites, I'm 67, milorganite predates me, and definitely predates Wisconsin's registry of biosolid application.
Howard and Robyn, let me ask you, and then I'm going to go to Neil, and then I'm going to go to George. Are clients, your sophisticated clients who are buying ag sites and reusing them beneficially, your home builders, your industrial developers, are they independently raising a concern about biosolids, or is this just an issue right now that's limited to our collective echo chamber?
I can go first if you want to. I mean, my experience is my clients are not independently raising this question.
Or anything.
Yeah. You know, they're into environmental due diligence, but I don't know that they're super focused on PFAS, quite honestly. I mean, I think that there's more general awareness, and there's certainly awareness by all the experts in the room that we need to be asking these hard questions. But I'm not certain that some of our home builder clients really understand what biosolids are either, right? I feel like it is a education level, but I thought, and I'm jumping to Neil ahead, but Neil mentioned earlier that there on the Map Direct, there's a listing of all the biosolid application sites in Florida that you could find in Map Direct. I don't know how current it is, Howard. Is it, 2025 sites or 2024, 2020 sites? But I thought that was super interesting, and Neil can elaborate on that. But to answer your question, my experience with a lot of large home builders that my firm represents, zero knowledge.
So you've teed up a question I want to ask Neil, but before we do that, I want one last question, and I won't forget that other question that we want to start with Neil, to the lawyers, and that's this. 5 years ago, when we started the conference, we asked the question, or I asked the question to the legal panel, do you recommend to your clients that you test or not test for PFAS? And back then, on day one, day Z in certain communities, the answer was, no, you're nuts to recommend testing because it's way too early. Where are we now with biosolids?
But my memory of that, Howard, or excuse me, Michael, was that...
People get us mixed up
all the time, sorry. My recollection is you said test, and everybody else on the panel said do not test.
That's right.
The first year. And then we kind of came and I gave credit to you and said, I agree, you've got to really think hard before you recommend against testing.
So where are we now? Where are we now with biosolids on ag sites? Do we recommend testing or not?
So on just normal ag sites?
Yes.
Absent biosolid application, we don't test. Unless there was a burn pit that was put out with FFF foam or some other indicator that would be evidence of more than opportunistic C&D or landfill dumping, but by itself, the agrochemical trigger is not a testing criteria, at least to the way we look at it now.
So this is where I'm going to drill down on the issue, and then Neil, you're up.
Yeah.
So drilling down on the issue is, does your recommendation change? And that will provide a challenge to the consulting industry. Does your recommendation change in the absence of any information regarding whether or not biosolids were applied?
No.
Yeah, no, I agree. I feel like if we know a piece of property has been used for municipal biosolid application, even for 1 year, then I think you need to think very hard about testing, like you should test.
Right.
But if you don't have that information and it's just an ag site and you are looking at potential extraneous things like being next door to the Sarasota-Bradenton Airport, and then you know that maybe you want to test for other issues with AFFF, but if it's not a known true biosolid application, I'm still on the fence about testing.
I'm on the fence, but I'm leaning towards recommending testing. Question in the audience. Identify yourself, sir.
Robert Stevens, and consultant. I understood you said that the phase one was the document that was used to identify your issue. That's correct?
Sometimes. Sometimes. I've got a lot of sites where it's nowhere in the phase one.
I understand. Now, from a phase one's perspective, Is it a recognized environmental condition, or are you calling it a condition of concern?
I want to make sure I'm not
Yeah.
sure I heard it.
The question was.
I would say it's a business environmental risk.
I'm actually going to let the person who 1527-21 lets make that decision answer that question.
There we go.
Okay, in response to, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name already. In response to that business environmental risk, okay, does the standard require identification of a beer in the document, or is it only Rex?
I'm not sure.
Well, that's a separate question, right? That's an ASTM question, not really a PFAS and biosolids question.
But
Well-
it goes to the trigger for sampling.
Right, I mean, so if the question really, is that one on? If the question is, do I, as the environmental attorney, consider it a wreck? I do not, but I would consider it a business environmental risk, and any draft phase ones that I review on behalf of my client, before it's finalized, I would be saying, you need to address this issue directly and identify it as a business environmental risk. But that's my environmental legal response.
So we have a little bit of a difference of opinion, I think, although this is all coming fast and furious, which is wonderful. That's what we want the workshop to be. So our understanding of how this is framed may be a little different. If we document, if the consultant can document, and Neil, I'm really going to get to you now, if the consultant can document the application of biosolids at a site, it's a wreck. Then it would be a wreck, based on what science is currently telling us and how the regulations treat it. Neil, your question for you, 2 questions for you. As a general proposition, taking 3 steps back, what guidance as a consultant are you giving to your clients regarding the nature of the technical risk at these former ag sites being acquired for redevelopment relative to PFAS? That's number 1. And number 2, what can a consultant, and this goes to Robert's question a little bit, what can a consultant do to effectively research whether biosolids have been applied and whether those biosolids were sourced from a location such that PFAS is likely to be present?
Okay. Well, the technical risk question, you have, in Florida specifically, you have 2 unique situations. The gentleman you wanted to come here really badly is one of those situations. Miami-Dade County has its own approach to that. So you would be, the technical risk there is you're going to follow their guidance because they're going to give you the direction each time on the sampling. You can, and then I would use these colleagues to argue that if necessary. But they have something going on. So you start your process of making decisions well before you basically begin your due diligence. There's a developer and attorney approach. Then you'd have, if you end up in the state level, you can work around that because it's not as guided, and you can start working with different alternative ideas, to approach it. And the key thing for the consultant, and this gentleman here's brought it up, is we're on the technical side, as you pointed out, but the risk is where, this is all risk at the moment because the numbers are really unknown. We really don't know what's going to happen. We think we know what's going to happen, but what was it, the other day I heard of someone talk about punting for 3 years in the state. So our stuff is all risk-based. So when the developer comes in, and words of a developer on the technical approach is, I need to know as fast as possible, as cheaply as possible, as soon as possible before the clock runs and I spend money on yes or no. And we can only do X amount. So that goes to the other side, the due diligence side, where we would come up with that idea. There, we start off with, obviously, biosolids and the mapping that you can do on the state website and other areas. After that, I'd back up and go to the actual water treatment plants, find out they have inventories, they tell you where they deliver to, they may not overlap. The state may not have, there may not be a permitted site, but a guy says, that guy takes a truck every day. So you got to check them out. They should have records because they're supposed to keep those and they're audited. After that, go upstream to the industrial suppliers, the potential users. And actually, in the state right now, I know two projects where that is, this municipalities are doing that. They're now collecting PFAS samples or discharge samples to check for PFAS because of the rule coming up in 2029 that they have to have pre-treatment. So we would follow it up the chain and follow as far as we could.
So I want to bring us back to where we're going with beneficial reuse for post-biosolid application uses, post-agricultural applications. Local governments have seemed to be very, very, very reluctant to take responsibility for any chemical impact or contaminant load impact or even TMDL impact from biosolid applications that have come in, or from bioorganics or biomass applications that come in. The databases are relatively new as we've seen them. That registry of where biosolids are being land applied is relatively new, but the application process is relatively old. So your consultant needs to be able to look at indicators. Michael, you and I both worked on a site a long time ago, serially. And we don't need to name the site, but the site had no record of biosolid application. There's no registry of it, but there was a concrete channel box cut through the property, the foundation of which still remained. And outside of the phase one, just in conversations with this ranch manager as we were undertaking remediation, we found out that that was where the municipal sludge used to be left out in the channelization boxes, were to give it greater surface area so it would dry quicker. Well before the era of understanding PFAS, well before the era of understanding biosolid application. But if we were looking at it today, the fact that it's not in a registry doesn't matter, because PFAS isn't oxidizing and going away in 2 or 3 years. So we've got to, if indeed we are going to be concerned, and frankly my advice to my clients is to always test under that circumstance of we understand that there's biosolid application, largely because there's a difficult, if any, regulatory process anywhere in the country for how to handle this, especially if it's a multiple properties, multiple site plume, multiple generators type of circumstance, is to look for those other indicators, to have a more in-depth conversation with people who've worked that agricultural property, more than just the phase one questionnaire. Because I will tell you, on the North Carolina site that our client just walked away from because there wasn't a good regulatory path that would fit their development time frame, the phase one questionnaire mentioned nothing about biosolid application at all. And it was only walking the site with the current farmer that the consultant on that site found out about the biosolid application. The city had no record of it, and it was the city's application of it. Biosolid application on this was done 30, 40 years ago on multiple properties, some of which are existing communities now. And as we all know, nobody probably did anything about it. It was nice looking organic soil. It's probably sitting in somebody's front yard or backyard at this point. So I think not only do we need to pay attention to it, but we need to come up with innovative ways, in addition to looking at the mapping and the registry, to, on agricultural sites, divine whether, with our little forked twig, whether or not there could have been biosolid application here. And that goes back to your in the absence of evidence question.
Let's look into the future a little bit before we come back to the present and talk more about beneficial reuse and some of these hard questions for us as practitioners and hard choices for our clients and constituents. No one has their ear closer to the ground in Tallahassee than my good friend and colleague Jorge Caspary. Jorge, what do you see happening on the legislative front and on the agency front? What are you hearing? What are you seeing?
Thank you for inviting me. I think it's inevitable that biosolids and PFAS and biosolids, but not just PFAS, it's going to be looked at some point in the future. When is that going to happen? I think the agency right now is grappling with a standard for groundwater, soil, and drinking water, and they're having a hard time for a lot of reasons, not least Washington, D.C. and the new administration. Part of the issue with biosolids that I see is what was referred by Robyn and all three panelists, and it's a question of, is it mixed in soil? Is it what standard do we apply? Is it soil? I mean, groundwater, we can deal with it. Biosolid contains, it's a mix. And so what is going to be the standard? And the second thing that I'm going to say is probably as we know, Florida is a very agricultural state. The agricultural interests are very powerful. I mean, you just cannot call biosolids a hazardous substance. I mean, you're going to get, immediate feedback from the agricultural industry in that sense. I recall a case in Dade County where somebody called ag sites hazardous waste sites, and they got in trouble for that reason alone. I think at some point in time what you're going to see is that ag interests asking the legislature exactly what Wisconsin has done. Some form of liability relief, because ag was the receiver, the innocent party in this, right? And then you go back when a question of liability, well, the wastewater treatment plants are mostly owned by cities. Are they liable for anything? And so I think you'll see a chain sequence of events. First, DP needs to act together in terms of getting a standard. And we'll discuss what's going to happen tomorrow. So if you plan to be here pretty early, around 8 o'clock, when we will discuss this, it's a shameless plug. But I think that's where the issue is going to be. DEP needs to act together in terms of a standard. Then we'll look at this, but be sure that there will be some form of liability relief from the ag interests, which still are very powerful in the state. This is similar to the EDB scenario. Mm-hmm. Remember, back in the 80s, for those old of us, there was 400,000 acres contaminated with EDB at one point in time in Florida. So what ag interests did, so they wouldn't be liable, they proposed the delineated areas rule, which is going to be reopened here. And that resulted in ag not being liable for any issue. So I think that's where this issue is going to go. Yeah, cattle live bats. I mean, dry cleaners are not liable. I mean, petroleum is not liable. So I think that's where this issue is going to be in the near future. We're talking maybe medium term in the next 5 years. There will be some form. That doesn't mean that from a risk tolerance perspective, you still have to address this issue because it contains not only PFAS, it does contain arsenic, it does contain other nasties. So it's going to be an issue of risk tolerance. And then how do you manage that risk? It's where this is probably going to lead.
So that's a great response and very helpful, Jorge. Thank you. And I have a few thoughts with respect to your observations. The first of which is just to make the connection between your prediction, which I think is accurate, that we will see a proactive stance sooner than later by the ag industry to embrace other stakeholders to come up with a safe path forward. I put air quotes in safe because we could talk about what that means all day long. Safe to whom and for what, right? But I put back up on the screen the article that was published in Inside EPA on April 3rd discussing the outreach that the USDA did, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to a national coalition of scientists to come up with a practical standard for biosolids and how to grapple with the PFAS legacy on ag sites. And I think that's what you're saying will happen here soon. But notwithstanding that, or in addition to that, does anyone on this panel see, does anyone in the audience see, because we really want to solicit audience participation, the necessity of having some inciting event in Florida, some crisis that prompts the dialogue, Jorge, that you're talking about among the stakeholders? And I say that for this reason, and this is the hard question I want to ask. It all goes back to beneficial reuse, right? Because this is a beneficial reuse panel. And what kinds of decisions do we make as professionals supporting our clients and constituents who are putting themselves out there and buying and redeveloping these sites and raising capital, et cetera? In the state of Florida, we have a unforgiving, somewhat punishing, low threshold to cross liability regime for recovering not just economic damages, but for damages related to personal injury, right? It's, for those who don't know, the statute is 376.313 Florida statutes, and several years ago, there's a very famous case, not that long ago actually, that went up to the Florida Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that this statute, which had historically for decades only been used to recover monetary damages, also embraced causes of action for injury to human health, right? So far we've been talking about the economic component of beneficial reuse, and how do we gauge what that economic component will be, and when does that become an issue from a data perspective? We haven't quite said it that way, but that's inherent in the conversation we've had to date. When you're talking about impacts to human health and personal injury litigation and the plaintiff's bar in Florida, it's a completely different keg of nails, as my father would say, right? So keeping that risk in mind, the risk of a lawsuit from a plaintiff's attorney suing on behalf of a community of detached single-family homeowners who have bought from your development client, or against the local government that sold the land to the developer, right, or the farmer, is there now a higher level of diligence that we need to consider, and do we need to be more proactive now in the absence of data about whether or not biosolids were applied?
I want to coalesce your statement with Jorge's a little bit, because Jorge walks us through what is a pretty clear path of liability protection for the municipal waste stream. You didn't talk about, but we should, the FIFRA-esque protections for legal application of that onto the property. So I have no doubt that the plaintiff's bar will someday soon gear up, and when you want the lightning rod event, I think we already have it, it just hasn't happened yet, when all of those wastewater treatment plants throughout the state have to disclose their PFAS, PFOA concentrations in their stream, will be that watershed or that lightning rod event. But the question is, if I've got a local government that has got sovereign immunity, I've got a farmer who should be able to pose some FIFRA-esque type of defensive legal application, who's left with a D painted on their foreheads? Developers.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what's going to be the problematic aspect. And we run the fine line of who's worked on a PFAS site that has been easily and affordable to remediate from a soil perspective. Right? No, don't all jump up at once. How many of you guys? Right, all of you, none of you. Because there isn't a good pathway on this type of remediation. The standards are way, way, way too stringent. I had a conversation with the state of North Carolina's senior risk assessor from their active hazardous sites program, who told me she thought an appropriate standard, and the reason we were talking about what she thought was is because North Carolina has a complete lack of any standard on how to deal with this, but that you would assess PFAS, PFOA at a 10 to the minus 6 level, consistent with the upside or the high side of EPA guidelines, but she would be good from a risk assessment point of view of remediating at a 10 to the minus 4 level, the downside of the EPA range of acceptable risks. But even that leaves you with a lot of site you've got to remediate and some problematic handles. So unless we just want to come to the conclusion, as one of my planning professors did years ago in his book called The Egregious Invalidity of Single-Family Housing, unless we just want to come up to the conclusion that we need to stop building single-family houses with backyards that allow little Johnny to pick up a spoon, little Johnny Dirt Eater, my favorite character, to pick up a spoon and eat, we've got to come up with some normalized process, and we've got to be very careful about the risk of testing when there's no reason, arguably, to test. Because you know 5 times out of 10, if you test for PFAS, you're going to find it even if there's no indicator, just because it's in anything. We're taking a blood sample from you a little later today, and we're going to run it for PFAS, or Miami-Dade County's rain.
Jorge, I have a question for you. You've been a consultant for decades. You have a client who comes to you. They bought an old ag site. They want to build homes. The development will have a very significant open space for playgrounds, tot lots, recreation, yoga in the park, etc. They haven't started turning dirt yet. They're ramping up. They're getting ready to hire a contractor. They turn to you for advice. What cautionary advice, if any, do you give them with respect to this specific issue?
Well, a few facts that we all can agree on. As of today, in Florida, biosolids are being applied as we speak. There's no regulation that prohibits. 2, PFAS, as the last I know, are classified as hazardous substances by the EPA. Even though that classification is being challenged, there's no court that has decided against that.
And you're making the assumption that there will be an EPA tomorrow.
Right. And I'm making an assumption that EPA will continue to exist in its current fashion. I don't know.
But that litigation was stayed, and they just
Right.
asked for another
So-
30-day extension.
Exactly.
For
So-
Trump to decide.
Right. So right now we have a federal administration that's still in the books, right? It's saying PFAS are hazardous substances. So going back to your question, if I know of a site in Florida where there might have been indications, and that's it. That's where I go back to what is the level of risk tolerance of my client, their attorneys, the capital investors, and all that. If I know there was a application of biosolids or pesticides, even according to FIFRA, then my advice would be, look, until this issue is resolved by the courts or the administration decides that PFAS are not an issue anymore, then I would recommend that, yes, we test for pesticides, arsenic, like we do today, and then we test for these 2 chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, which are considered hazardous substances, even though the administration is saying, time out, we want to figure out our next strategy. Until I am told so, I would say my risk tolerance level may be lesser than somebody here, but right now I would recommend test.
Thank you, Jorge. Robyn, question for you. I'm Jorge's client. I've heard Jorge's opinion. I now come to you. I say, Robyn, I want to hire you. I have a recommendation from a consultant. I bought an ag site. I didn't do any testing. I've learned now that biosolids can be an issue. I don't have information one way or the other. I don't know that I'm going to get it. What's your legal recommendation?
You know what,
Remember, he already has the recommendation sitting in his file.
right, no. My recommendation would be, it's a business risk, but there's a great deal of uncertainty both on the state and the federal level on how PFAS is being handled, but you cannot ignore the facts and the potential risk. I mean, I had this scenario with a client on another site, not a biosolids, on a PFAS site, and they said, do you think the new administration is going to walk back these regulations? And I said, maybe, but we have to deal with the regulations that are in place now, and was referring to the Florida provisional screening target levels. So yes, I would still couch it in terms of, it's a business risk, you do what you want from a business standpoint, but as the technical recommendation and the legal recommendation, you should consider testing.
Let me add that.
Absolutely.
And the reason I'm making that recommendation is because as a consultant, and most of you know me, I issued a memo when I was a director at DEP that said development in Florida, land development, it's not going to stop. So because I would recommend my client and his distinguished attorneys, or even, and Neil, the ultimate issue is how do you manage the risk of exposure? And in a development, you can do that. I remember when Howard, my first day as a division director at DEP, came over with Apollonia. How do you manage that risk? I mean, we all face risks in our lives. I mean, PFAS is in our bloodstream or tissues, but how do you manage the risk of a kid in a residential scenario, having, limiting that exposure or eliminating? And I think that's why I make that recommendation. Test, but you know what? Get a consultant that knows how to manage that risk.
So
how to test.
what are the indicators outside of there's a record of delivery of biosolids sitting on the site? What are the indicators you guys look at?
It's a great question. Neil?
And Brian in the audience has.
Good.
Well, there's a ton of consultants
Jorge?
out in the audience.
Brian, raise your hand. The microphone's coming your way.
Here's Brian.
So to your comment, Howard.
But before you continue, identify yourself for the group.
Oh, yeah.
Say hello.
Brian Moore with GHD, consultant. So say you identified a site, potentially biosolid application. You make the smart choice and recommend testing. I assume you're mostly concerned about the soil rather than the water per se, just from a risk standpoint, say?
From a risk point of view, sure, because I can easily protect against direct exposure to groundwater.
Right.
I'm not taking care of the liability issue if this site is the only generator, but that's addressing the public health and safety issue.
So the lowest hanging fruit from my perspective is soil, because you're going to have a huge jump cost in soil if you've got an
Yes.
issue, right? Plus you've got more that's the more concerning pathway for exposure to occupants. But I'm also concerned about groundwater, specifically if I have a plume that's migrating off site. But continue.
Good. Those are good points. So you test both. So you test the soil and you get some value that's, let's say, is below the provisional CTL established by the state. What's the scenario there? Like, I don't know. That's my question. How do you handle that? Maybe you have a little bit, you're going to see some PFAS, but it's not really above that CTL value. How do you advise your client in that situation? I don't know, Jorge, maybe you've seen a lot of this data. It sounds like, Howard, you have, but what do you typically see? If it's biosolid application, do you usually see it really high? Or do you get these scenarios where it's kind of in between?
So I've gotten that scenario a couple of times already. The problem with a provisional standard is it's provisional, right? And the worst thing in the world is to test and pass the provisional standard and then have that standard drop as we saw happen when EPA rolled out its rules, which are now under appeal. But at the same time, if you've got presence but low quantity or low level of PFAS, PFOA, you've got to ask the follow-up site development question. Are you an exporter site? Are you an importer site? If you're bringing in 2 feet of clean fill, then your superficial area is probably going to be absolutely dandy with respect to PFAS soil impacts. And if you blend it, maybe the top 4 feet, and might you have to take some soil management aspects if pools are going in or later utilities? Yeah, but the same thing that you take for soil management activities on a capped site. You can't just look at the data and say it's yes or no, because you've got to figure out what's going on. If it's an exporter site, you probably want to pencil in disposal rather than sale of the organic fill that's leaving, because that is cradle to grave liability. You go sell it to an elementary school down the street, and neither one of us are sleeping at nights anymore.
What's the data like?
What? I have not seen any data where we're picking up PFAS in any great number. I've seen a couple cases. The data I've seen is way over the provisional levels on biosolids, way over. So the site I looked at in North Carolina, if I've got to remediate to 10 to the minus 6, every single test return I had for soils was above 10 to the minus 6. Up to and including the boundary and probably rolling over the boundary. If I had to remediate to 10 to the minus 4, I think on this site about 20% of the site exceeded it, and that's manageable from a soil management perspective.
I'd like to provide you with a legal option relative to your question. What do you do when you encounter a site with concentrations above the federal MCL, proposed federal MCLs, right, of 4 parts per trillion? That's what you're asking, but below, at least for groundwater, the state provisional CTLs of 70 combined PFOS and PFOA. One strategy that we've recommended clients consider is that you go hand in hand, you disclose to the state and lock in the higher number with a RAP approval order. And you do that if you believe that at some point there's going to be a day of reckoning at the state level, and DEP and the legislature will jump into it and ratchet down the number to below 70.
In that scenario, I'm not worried about regulatory exposure. I'm worried about the plaintiff's bar.
Yeah.
I thought your question was a soil question, though. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's about.
Again, I mean, ultimately, it's a great question. I mean, it is, you know, then you would apply a provisional. I mean, DEP did their homework with UF in terms of generating a provisional soil level and a provisional groundwater. I mean, you give credit where credit is due. UF is fairly solid in terms of how they develop those numbers. The question again comes, you know, who, as a consultant, and having been a former regulator, who ultimately are you going to protect? As your client from any lawsuits that may develop years down the road when somebody finds out, oh, you sold me a crappy bag of goods by telling me that there was nothing in this. I would say, you know, ultimately again is managing the exposure and how much liability tolerance these people have, but also what Mike said is how much cost is going to add to the project to manage that risk. I mean, we're talking about economics. We're a capitalistic country. And what I find is if a developer, unless there is an insurmountable obstacle in Florida, which to date I haven't seen in terms of risk, in environmental risk, they'll go for it. It is because Florida is just that. The demand for land is so huge in our state, both infill and outfill, that the developer will go and say, arsenic, okay, George, tell me how you want to handle this. Okay, you need to modify your site development, your site prep, you know, and ultimately for groundwater, everybody needs to be on city water. We can talk to DP about a delineated area, right, Howard?
Right.
Right?
We can definitely
And
talk to them about
so
a delineated
there
area.
are ways to do it, but I yet have to see in Florida a developer or an investor, equity capital, or saying, oh, the environmental problems are just too much here, I'm gonna walk away. I haven't seen one. Maybe you guys have, but I haven't seen one. Florida, I mean, go up north, north of I-75. Go to Pasco County, left and right on 589. It's just full of development on former ag lands, and it's gonna continue to do so.
We have a question in the audience, or a comment.
Eric Sager with Geosyntec Consultants. You've been mentioning about the provisional soil cleanup target levels, and I heard testing specifically for PFOA and PFOS. Is the elephant in the room, EPA has RSLs that are much lower for soil that include additional PFAS constituents. Looking at the crystal ball, what is the state going to do with those, and should that also be considered in the risk assessment?
Question to me, Eric?
To anyone.
Yeah, you want to answer? I mean,
And it really depends on who's sitting in the governor's office.
Right, and we have worked on the RSLs with Geosyntec on other sites, so again, it's a business decision by the client on how to address them and how to take in consideration those RSLs in looking at their site plan and looking at what the proposed development is. If it's an industrial warehouse usage, I think it's a little easier than
a
the single-family
detached,
home.
right.
And so I think it's important for the consultants to identify the RSLs and look at, as well as the Florida provisional screening target levels for soil. But in my experience, we're a little less focused on the RSLs on the sites that I've worked in. But where those have come up, they've been industrial warehouse sites that I've looked at most recently.
Shopping
So,
centers, if indeed people still
yeah.
build those.
Mine are all industrial warehouses.
Eric,
Makes the whole
Eric,
lot
do you have a
easier.
follow-up?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
I was just going to say, and yeah, I mean, and part of the reluctance of DEP is precisely because we don't know what's going on up in EPA. I mean, right now EPA is probably thinking, what have we done when we received 200,000 comments in terms of the rule promulgation? But I think in Florida, you know, and come back tomorrow, and I think in Florida the issue is going to be, again, at one point in time, we're going to have a standard. Right. There's no doubt about it. I mean, that's coming. For those of you that are betting money on not having a standard, change your mind. There will be a standard. The question is, what is that standard? And more importantly, in Florida, as you know, the legislature has told DEP, you just cannot come up with a standard and tell everybody, tell me, DEP, how much is this going to cost in regulatory response from private parties? That is the biggest question in Florida. Unlike different states like Massachusetts, where I have worked, or California, they don't care how much is it going to cost or who's going to pay. Florida is a different perspective because you have a different political party probably ruling here. The question is, how much is this going to cost and who's going to pay?
And a good example to look at is the back and forth from the TMDL stormwater rule, which delayed implementation for almost a decade.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Ultimately, as the state got highly involved in what is the cost of compliance with this, and revised and re-revised and re-revised.
Yeah.
So
You're going to see that. I mean, what is the cost of compliance?
Show of,
hey, I don't think the guys at EPA are wondering what it is we did, because I don't think any of those guys are employed there anymore.
show of hands, how many consultants do we have in the audience? And of this group, how many of your clients have raised biosolids as an issue of concern?
Independently?
many.
Wow. Independently raised it?
Like, ask me the question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Are your clients biosolid producers?
They're in the military.
Okay, there you go. There you go. Is your client a biosolid producer? one of the southwest counties is proactively working on a project to treat biosolids for PFAS. And looking at that project and trying to get other, like on a flow control standpoint, get other counties and cities in the area to send it to their facility for treatment.
We'll
So-
have to get them here next year. We'll have
Exactly.
a panel.
And then remember, St. Lucie County regulated biosolid application in certain geographic areas, but it was unrelated to PFAS. It was related to TMDL loads into outstanding Florida waters.
Well, there are lots of wonderful strategies that are emerging all across the country. We don't see much of that here at all in Florida. And I have some of that information on the slides. And if you want the source material, just email or write. We can provide it. There's a question there in the audience.
Yeah, hi, I'm John Dorsey. I'm just a little interested in the PFAS markets. But you had a map up there, and you had mentioned that 31 states are passing down regulations. Was that on the biosolids or just on the wastewater? delivering-
Biosolids.
The
Biosolids.
biosolids, right?
Yeah.
So in those regulations, are you aware of any levels of what's acceptable with PFAS? Are they actually going to hand down to the wastewater or drinking water at a state level that they're going to be required to bring these contaminants down to a level that would be acceptable? And or the wastewater, how many of those facilities are not selling those biosolids today because of agriculture? I know that the one up in Maine, it was 82 farms, and they shut selling those biosolids as fertilizer, and it really hurt the fresh, the organic grow that they sold to New York restaurants, put them all out of business. So they're all suing the wastewater facility, and that wastewater facility won't sell their biologicals anymore for fertilizer. Are you finding that when they making these regulations, are they stopping their wastewater from selling it as fertilizer?
I have not seen in any of the states that I've looked at, and I haven't looked at all of them yet, any express an absolute prohibition imposed on the sale or distribution of biosolids from wastewater treatment plants.
But I think you might expect potentially some reevaluation of the Class A and Class B biosolid approval process to accommodate PFAS, PFOA, because I don't think it does right now. I think it accommodates vectors, pathogens, and some limited amount of contaminants.
But no one stopped selling that as fertilizer to offset the cost of running the wastewater facilities?
City of Milwaukee. I've been selling it for 70 years probably.
Yeah, I knew that.
I think if you're specific about Florida, I mean, what I said earlier, at some point in time in the not too distant future, there will be a surface water standard by which wastewater treatment plants cannot discharge treated industrial water or wastewater into surface water that exceed that surface water standard. So that's going to be beneficial to biosolids because they still will continue to apply as long as they meet that criteria. But that's going to incur the cost to the cities or owners to develop technologies, filtration technologies that can treat PFAS in the incoming wastewater stream. Is that going to happen in Florida? Yes. How soon? I cannot tell you right now, but it will happen.
Well, it's also going to affect consumptive use permitting. If you take a look at the various local governments around the state whose consumptive use allocation is dependent, and I'm thinking Palm Beach County, front and center, is dependent on mandatory purple pipe reuse of treated wastewater as part of continuing their allocation of groundwater withdrawals for potable use. Once that's disallowed.
Florida's got a program called One Water, you may know. where the legislature is saying, we gotta reuse wastewater because our reservoirs and our sources of potable water are being depleted since we've grown so fast in the last 30 years. And so what is that going to mean if we're gonna be reusing treated wastewater as potable water that has PFAS? That's not going to happen. So it goes back to the biosolids issue. At some point in time, the wastewater industry is gonna have to come up with the realization that they have to treat incoming wastewater for PFAS. It's gonna happen.
And on that note, and there's a question over here. Before we get to that question, one last point about your excellent question is that if there's a common denominator among all of the state-based plans that I've read, it's the third bullet item, which is a little consistent, Jorge, with what you said, consistent with the third bullet item on the slide I have above, or on the slide I have on the screen right now, which is source reduction, right? Source reduction, so you've got reduced loading, source reduction or elimination, so to the maximum extent possible, you have reduced loading at the treatment plant. Yes?
Yeah, just to piggyback off of your statement of the wastewater treatment plants will eventually have to treat because there will be a surface water standard. I thought it was interesting how you said that they would most likely treat the influent. Do you think, because obviously if they treat the influent, that would then therefore take care of the biosolid issue before everything's separated. I think there might be some issues with the treating on the influent. Or do you think that it would be easier for them to treat the effluent because you don't have all that organic material, but then you still have the biosolid issue to deal with, and with PFAS in the biosolid?
I slept at a Holiday Inn, but I'm not a wastewater engineer. So I'm an engineer and a geologist, but not a wastewater. I think that's an excellent question. Do you treat the influent coming in versus the effluent?
You can't.
Yeah, I think it would be really hard to treat the influent, but you saying that it could treat the influent was like, oh, there's a possibility, because then you have the biosolid issue taken care of, but I think it would be more difficult.
But ultimately, I think the message I'm trying to convey is, from a biosolids perspective, there will be regulations. Now, bear in mind, from a politics perspective, and I've been in politics in Florida, at one point in time, the Ag Commissioner will be running for governor, so this issue will be in his radar screen here next year. So, let's come back next year.
So, Jorge, do you deal with it by changing industrial sewage loading
That's
criteria?
what I was going to say. You pre-treat, or you work to require the industrial sites to pre-treat.
Absolutely.
So
That goes to the source reduction strategy.
Exactly. So if you are, even in this twisty economy, look for buying shares of people that do industrial wastewater pre-treatment.
Look for buying shares of granulated activated carbon.
Yes.
I believe we have a question in the
That
back.
will be your retirement fund.
That's right.
Hi, my name is Ping Wang. I work for the state of Delaware from the regulator side. So we've done quite a bit of biosolid studies, but back to the latest question about treating the influent versus effluent. I'm the wastewater guy. So we are tracing back where the PFAS coming from. Most industries, they have to do pre-treatment before they come to our municipal wastewater treatment plant. That is the plan. With that said, there are facilities, municipal-wise, they build, put a circuit in, treat all the influent, and get effluent tested. We are going to very soon, and we expect in a near year or two, definitely in our wastewater treatment permit, there will be a permit condition to monitor your PFAS content, especially for those surface water with NAPT discharges. Did you guys say the EPA's would propose ambient surface water quality standard for PFAS? Extremely low. I wouldn't think any lab could test it just yet, but those were based on risk analysis and stuff. Anyway, all this back to biosolids. I think the biosolid questions are very beneficial use. Let's say if we focus on that, I do say based on our study, they might have a lot of problems with the sites. In state of Delaware, and for other states as well, we have Class B land application permits where you treat to a less standard mostly for germs and those stuff. But for Class A with a higher treatment standard, the gate is open. We have biosolids made, fertilizers made biosolids coming from other states. They just pallets in Home Depot. Guess what? You could go there and get stuff without knowing even biosolids in there. But with our Class B sites, we do have permits. We track their use, their loading. We did a study 2-3 years ago, starting just finished phase 1. We're doing phase 2. The soil is not that high by all means. If you look at the screening level of CTL, we call it screening level in Delaware, it's like 20 BBT, let's say this way, 20, 30 BBT in that level. But if you look at the groundwater, even at a lower level than that, the groundwater beneath the land application site exceeds big time EPA's current maximum contamination level, the MCLs, for PFOA and PFOS, as well as the hazard index. So I think in the future, the standard will be made to say what going through all this soil profile, your groundwater is going to look like. That will trigger something for remediation-wise, for screening level, for the soil contamination, either from biosolid application or from something else. There's going to be a huge issue and huge impact. The 2 states banned biosolid application. I'm sure you guys know that. Our recommendation is we're going to probably most likely, I'm a technical guy. I'm a geologist, I'm a hydrogeologist, and I'm a wastewater guy. That's about it. I'm a technical guy, so I have no much saying about the recommendations in our regulations right now, although I might testify. But I will say the trigger to me is going to be what's the groundwater going to look like coming through that soil profile. And then that number is coming up pretty quick. We have about a few hundred samples tested. We have a relationship between soil content, biosoil content, groundwater content, and we're jumping to down gradient domestic wells where we have people drinking that water, which is we expect above the MCLs EPA just put up. We want to stop those, mitigate those, and then come back, treat the source, get the influent treated, for example, and deal with all the other issues. So I hope that will shed some light on the issues.
Wonderful. The hour is growing late, the end is coming near or coming nigh.
The end is nigh.
The end is now. Are there any final questions or observations from the audience? Comments, questions? Yes, sir. Hold on, microphone's coming.
Thank you all for doing this. My name is Pat Stanford. I am with Coviana. We do industrial wastewater, mostly for landfill leachate nationwide, so I have a lot of experience and a lot of things coming up here. One of the big questions you ask about is anybody stopping the sale of this? Johnson County, Texas, Fort Worth, 2 years ago, on about 7 days' notice, blocked the acceptance of any landfill leachate into their wastewater treatment plant. And about 3 months ago, actually less than that, less than 2 months ago, they actually bought out of their contract with Sinagro to do it. They spent $2 million of money to get out of having to sell their biosolids. So yes, that's coming. There are certainly some people who are very risk averse to this and going forward in terms of doing that. I'm pretty certain the state of Maine has a complete ban on land application of biosolids at all from all of their wastewater treatment plants. And I think that might also be true in Michigan right now as well. So there are a lot of places that's not going to be the case anymore. I work a lot with landfills. The landfills are very concerned about what they're going to do if they get that much extra biosolids coming in and how they're going to be able to handle it.
It was a little hard for me to hear. Were you mentioning Sinagro?
Yes.
Right, that's that article that I put up on the screen here. I believe that's what the reference is to.
Yes, the Fort Worth project is the one that I was referring to, yes.
Very good. Any final questions or comments from the audience?
So for those who couldn't hear, he thinks that Connecticut also has a 100% ban on land application of biosolids.
Any final thoughts from the panel?
I have one follow-up. Any idea what they're going to be doing with their municipal wastewater sludge if they're not selling it?
I'm assuming they're going to have to put it in a landfill someplace. I don't know, but I know they have their criminal environmental investigator who is the one who is pushing that whole thing and has the county council very much up in the arms about it.
Last one.
Go ahead, Jorge.
I was going to say, from a biosolids perspective, the major contributor of PFAS and heavy metals is, a society need is the landfill, the solid waste industry through leachate.
Right, leachate.
Between Orlando and, I would say, Port Richey and Fort Myers, there's about 80 million gallons per year generated from landfills. Those of you that are in the landfill industry know that. So if you're looking for a potential market, it is that pre-treatment that needs to happen from those industries that are generating PFAS containing industrial wastewater that is going to be opened up in Florida. It happened.
And the landfills, though, just like the industrial in the wastewater treatment plants, are also passive receivers of this, that it's all come from us as society. So we're still allowing everyone to manufacture and use all these compounds. It's still going to end up in the trash out of my closet for the next 20 or 50 years. I'm a pack rat. And I'm sure everybody else is also. So there's going to be a very long time that these things are going to keep ending up in the landfill. And yes, what we need is a federal standard to require the treatment of PFAS coming out of the landfills so that we have an equal playing field for all of the landfills and an enhanced capability for the wastewater treatment plants to not have to handle it.
So to put this pre-treatment into a little bit of cost perspective, the Cone Mills Superfund site in Greenville, South Carolina, is treating the superficial water of a settlement lagoon that was part of the Cone Mills fabric and bleaching plant, known PFAS generator, that caught fire when they went out of business and luckily was put out with AFFF foam. So the lagoon has no shortage of PFAS issues. It's, I believe, a 5-gallon lagoon, and there's about 10 feet of water.
5 acre.
What? 5 acre, I'm sorry. And about 10 feet of water. Cost is about, for the pre-treatment, running it through GAC before it can go into the municipal wastewater treatment system, meeting their sewage loading criteria, is about $100,000 right now. So put that into an industrial process that's doing that every day, that volume every day, to put in something, at least what we know now, running it through GAC, the process of running it, the purchase of the GAC, and then the disposal of the GAC starts to get pretty expensive pretty quickly.
That's a good tee up for some of the technical sessions starting tomorrow. Robyn, Neil, any final thoughts or comments?
I had a final question. Do you, and maybe it's to you, Michael and Jorge, do you anticipate that in order to get, we'll say, additional standards in Florida, that there's going to be a lot of lobbying and negotiation to get liability protection for certain passive users or passive receivers? How do you see that going on the federal and the state level?
So at the state level, there has been absolutely no talk whatsoever, not in this session, not in the last session, even though there was a PFAS package that failed last session, regarding potential liability exemptions for passive receivers or any other parties that somehow touch this PFAS issue, whether it be in biosolids or otherwise. At the federal level, there is a lot of discussion, a tremendous amount of discussion in both the Senate and in the House, and there's actually a Senate bill, hasn't been filed, but it's been proposed by Shelley Capito, who is the current chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, to create a statutory exemption for certain passive receivers like farmers, like wastewater treatment plants, like landfills, and there's some bipartisan support for that. There currently exists at the EPA level an administrative initiative to forego enforcement against passive receivers that was, I think, taken up less than enthusiastically under the last administration, and likely much more so under this administration. Neil,
Still leaving the ultimate end user, the developer,
exposed?
with the cost of dealing with the residual soil impacts or groundwater impacts.
That's right. Neil?
Yeah, I agree. It's taking away the liability, but you are going to still have the end result.
Right.
You're going to be stuck. So,
Right.
but that's why we're seeing now them backing it up and going to
Hold on,
towards-
Robyn, will you pass him the microphone because there are people listening on Zoom?
But that's why you're starting to see voluntarily, and I think this is part of that discussion, this upstream focus. It's not only pre-treatment, by the way, it's also changing your method, and also zero discharge. I have clients that are working on zero discharge concepts. So there's a whole bunch of engineering out there that's going on to change this as the primary contributor down the line. So, but yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, one of the questions is, what if they align the cleanup rules? What if the numbers come out and they're hard and fast? Every consultant that raised their hand in here is delighted, because it's going to get crazy, but as a risk-based thing.
There's no real funding to do that.
Yeah, there's no funding. That's the
And I
problem.
know that Wisconsin article that you mentioned, that the Wisconsin governor was sponsoring a legislation, is that right? Legislation, but there was funding tied to that.
That's right, and
I
that's
think
why it
there's a
failed
lot
the
of
year
funding.
before.
Yeah.
It's the second time this particular state is proposing liability exemptions.
Right. But this is, I mean, Florida's been experiencing this. We've gone through patrolling, we've gone to dry cleaner, we've gone to, and they work, but it's not fast. And depending on the urgency of this, you still leave the developers out in the cold. They don't get any
It doesn't surprise me, and Neil, thank you for that. It doesn't surprise me that we are concluding with some discussion about the technical aspects of regulation, of cleanup, of source reduction, because that's where the conference is ultimately going over the next 2 days. But because this workshop is focused very specifically and in narrow fashion on an important issue in beneficial reuse, right? The exposure created by PFAS and biosolids, I want to invoke the moderator's privilege and conclude on this note, that I think we can all agree that there is a greater risk than is commonly recognized in Florida on these former ag sites that are being reused beneficially, even more elevated than for a residential reuse scenario, but still elevated for any type of a reuse scenario to the extent the question is not called. And it's difficult, it's...
Nothing was working out, and I wanted to get the hell out of there. Claim to be an expendable?
Oh, that's embarrassing.
Well, it's his auto warranty guy.
Yeah, it's difficult to call the question when there's no history or documentation supporting actual use or the absence of that use. And so as we stand here today, I think we can all agree that we have to err on the side of being very conservative and more often than not recommending a more rigorous protocol for due diligence, which may result in soil and groundwater testing that would otherwise not be obvious in the absence of a recognized environmental condition, to go back to the first question we had from the audience.
Well, and Michael, the one thing I would take issue with, Florida probably has on the scale a lower risk than a lot of other states, because you got to take a look at what's going into the biosolids. We've got very few textile mills in the state of Florida that are going into our wastewater treatment
Paper
system.
mills.
We've got very few heavy plastic manufacturing systems or other type of, or pesticide manufacturing systems, unlike the Rust Belt, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, that have a much heavier concentration of PFAS generators at the industrial level that are feeding industrial wastewater into the system. What we're seeing in North Carolina and South Carolina dwarfs anything that we're seeing in Florida.
So now we have a cliffhanger, and we're going to stick a pin in this for next year, because I can make the argument, as I know you can, as I'm sure many in the audience can who work in certain counties, that you don't have to have a significant exceedance of a contaminant of concern to result in tremendous chaos from a regulatory perspective, right? That still translates into incremental costs that would otherwise not be incurred.
But a difference between looking at a site that has arsenic at 2.4 and arsenic at 24.
Or 204.
Or 204 or 240 in terms of coming up with a remedial plan that protects health, safety, and welfare and still leaves you with a viable economical project.
More to follow on that. Thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful panel. Thank you to my panelists and great audience participation.